As a WhatsApp group among social entrepreneurs, connecting to envision real Catalyst 2030 started life as a WhatsApp group among social entrepreneurs, connecting to envision real transformational change. Launched at the World Economic Forum in January 2020, it's grown into a global movement accelerating change to ensure the SDGs are reached by 2030. Fueled by passion, our 550 members working in 175 countries have collectively put in an amazing 50,000 volunteer hours, touching the lives of 2 billion people. And we're driven by values, to which we hold ourselves accountable. 2020 was a busy year, co-creating 3 reports with partners and producing one of our own. Inviting high-level guests to participate in the Catalyzing Change campaign, hosting fireside chats and expert hours, which will be continuing in 2021. To celebrate our achievements, together we placed our supporters in the limelight with the first Catalyst 2030 Awards for Systemic Change. With the blessing of the Dalai Lama, we celebrated finalists and winners in the following categories: special recognition for our early supporters, individual philanthropists, donor organizations, philanthropic intermediaries, corporate organizations, bi- and multilateral organizations, and 4 regional winners in the category of national governments. And now on to Catalyzing Change Week 2021. During this social entrepreneur-led event, we bring together diverse stakeholders in over 100 sessions to showcase their systems change efforts and the best practices that can accelerate our work in pursuit of the SDGs.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. You're all welcome to the Catalyzing Change Week, Day 3. My name is Iniekung. I am the program coordinator for Philanthropy Circuit, and it's amazing to see so many people joining into the chat. With me today, I have a host of development practitioners in African philanthropy who I'll be introducing in a minute. But I'm just going to go over what Catalyzing Change Week is all about as we go on, and how important this session is for African philanthropy, and then also for the wider conversation across the spans. The idea for mobilizing philanthropy for Africa's development came as a result of various conversations that Philanthropy Circuit has had as an organization, and then the direction our research, especially now, taking. Our mission in Philanthropy Circuit is to create and to influence a positive narrative of Africa's philanthropic development, to foster collaboration, and then to also enhance the production of data sets and knowledge sharing. Now, in our search for partnerships, we came across the 2030 network, and it was an alignment of purposes really for us. So joining the network was a no-brainer, and it was just an amazing platform. It had an amazing opportunity for us to connect with other global change makers, and then to create platforms such as these to discuss and to move on with system change conversations, in the hope that we're able to change not just the narrative, but the actual practice of philanthropy by African development practitioners and for the larger audience. Hello, Daniel. I'm going to be introducing our amazing panelists today. With us today from the Global Fund for Community Foundations, we have Emerhi. Emerhi joined the GCF for short this April 2021, but before then, she had over a decade of experience in international development practice. She was the project director for the KC Trust Fund, a donor advised fund managed by Trust Africa in Nigeria, where she instilled participatory community-based grant making for sustainable development in Ogoni land. Over the last 18 years, she has spent her time working in international development, supporting human rights defenders and organizations in both the Middle East, North Africa region, also encouraging civil society to push towards democratic initiatives, and then working with youth-led Nigerian and US organizations towards advocating for greater inclusion. It's nice to have you and amazing that you're able to join us here today, Estee. Thank you for joining in. Our second panelist and speaker for today is Mr. Tendai Murisa, who is a development practitioner. His research and publication focuses on citizens agency and solidarity, public policy, land and agrarian reforms, and philanthropy in Zimbabwe and Africa. Personally, I came to know Tendai from another webinar I attended, and I was really fascinated with his work and the publications. And I immediately, Googled SIVIO, and it was so great to see a research and non-profit policy advocacy organization in Zimbabwe really doing great things, pushing out great content, creating data sets that are actually useful and so informative. Tendai was educated at the University of Zimbabwe, City of Leeds, and currently he is the executive director for the CCW Institute based in Zimbabwe. And then our final panelist with us today is Jim Chick Fomunjong. Now, I just skipped my mind to actually ask Jim how to properly pronounce his surname, and I hope I didn't do a bad job. But Jim is an enthusiastic and experienced communications professional and organizational development practitioner with excellent skills in effectively managing both internal and external communications with corporate bodies and influencing change processes with African civil society organizations. Currently, he is the head of the Knowledge Management Unit with the West African Civil Society Institute, and Jim possesses about 10 years experience in the development sector and is very keen on supporting organizations to become sustainable. It's so amazing to have you all, and I'm glad you are here. We will also be looking out in the comment section for everyone. Please let us know your name. Let us have where you're calling in, where you're dialing in from. Let us know if there are questions that come up in the course of the discussion. Please share. We always enjoy an engaging chat, and the speakers will try as much as possible to engage and, of course, answer any questions that come up or give any references or links as the session goes on. Now, to kick off the discussion, why mobilizing philanthropy in Afro-Africa development is important. To provide some context, when we refer to philanthropy, we are referring to the practice of giving itself, the institutions, philanthropic foundations, giving circles, the system of philanthropy itself in Africa, for African civil society. This discussion is aimed at a learning session to see if we are actually on the right path, if the systems that we are currently enabling, the systems that we're currently operating, if it's working for us as Africans, as African practitioners, as African development practitioners, and how best we can mobilize philanthropy for Africa's development. And so, Jim, as the head of knowledge management for WACSI, of course, I would just like you to give your own reflections on how well philanthropy has effectively been mobilized on the continent.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all our many viewers. It's good to have everyone here. And thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. With regards to how well philanthropy has been mobilized in Africa, I would say there's been a very significant mobilization in terms of philanthropy in Africa, and that is a practice, I would say it's cultural, in terms of for Africans to give to causes that benefit ourselves, our people, our community. So it is a practice that has very much been exploited on the continent, is currently still being exploited, and it's at different levels. There is the micro level where at family levels or at an individual level, people give to support initiatives in their communities. Even still at the micro level, people give to support their villages, their specific communities if they are living in urban centers. But there are also macro levels whereby individuals like the Dangotes, like the Baba Danpolos of Cameroon, they give at a larger scale to support bigger or initiatives to address different social causes in their respective countries or the continent at large. And with COVID in particular, this has actually enabled the different levels of philanthropy to actually manifest at full scale. You would agree with me, in some countries like Nigeria, like Ghana, like Cameroon, that I'm fairly aware of initiatives that were driven, individuals in the countries, nationals of those countries equally gave to support initiatives driven by our respective governments, as well as corporate entities within the countries, whether those corporate entities are national or international in nature. So African philanthropy is really something that is growing on a larger scale. I just think what needs to be done, which I think we'll be discussing more elaborately during this session, is to see how well we are capturing what is actually being done, how well we are taking note of what is actually being done to inform or harness that practice such that we can peg specific development milestones in the near future to the practice of philanthropy in a specific country or in a specific or in our continent as a whole, or why not a specific region on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Unfortunately, my connection is a bit poor, so I'm going to have to go off video. Please indulge me, everyone, while this conversation continues. But I was really, fascinated by how we need to capture the data for African philanthropy and for giving. How you have noted that it's important that African philanthropists have been giving. There have been recorded instances, and of course, unfortunately, there are certain instances where that goes unrecorded of philanthropic giving, but these need to be taken note of. This need to be harnessed. Information needs to be harnessed so that we can work on, used for future purposes. It can be used as references, it can be used to build data sets that can also inspire others to give as well. I'm going to be reaching out to SA now. As a practitioner working with a philanthropic institution, we are aware that the Global Fund for Community Foundations is a grant-making organization. I would like to get your expert opinion on how resource mobilization can be better and more realistically addressed. If African philanthropists are giving, if there are giving practices currently on the continent, how is it that Africa still seems to be lagging behind in the data? How are we still foreign aid dependent? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to put my video on for a little bit so you know that at least I'm real, but I have some connection issues, bandwidth issues with my video, and it's popping up that I don't have a strong connection here. So I'll switch off if you don't mind, and I beg your forgiveness for that, and continue. I think, when we're talking about philanthropy in Africa or African philanthropy, as Jim mentioned, this isn't really a new phenomenon. I mean, philanthropy happens every day in Africa. It happens between families, it happens within communities, It happens from donors to recipients or grantee partners on the ground. It happens from diaspora giving from the West, from abroad, back into the country. And what is not, I think if you're thinking about exactly how much comes into Africa on an annual basis, how much aid, official aid comes into Africa, we're looking at the billions. I think the last figure I have is somewhere around 133 billion that comes in every year. When you're thinking about what leaves the continent, you're looking at double that in terms of extractive industries, what leaves African families from here to the West. You're looking at over 200 billion is extracted from the continent. And so you have approximately a net loss of about 85 billion that is being lost to African users and African citizens themselves, governments. In terms of resource mobilization, or specifically African philanthropy and how that can change, we're looking at something, I think the African Philanthropy Forum a couple of years ago produced a report that specifically highlighted a new way of harnessing African philanthropy, or how we practice it on the continent. And they termed it dynamic localism. And in many aspects, this also reflects or mirrors a lot of the principles and values of the Shift to Power movement that the Global Fund spearheaded back in 2016. And the dynamic localism for philanthropy centers around 5 major points or principles. Really shifting, the first one is really shifting the locus of power, focusing on the local assets that are already on the ground, whether this is in money, whether this is in people and knowledge, whether it's in local assets, buildings, tools. The second thing is around moving from a digital first planning or programmatic work in terms of supporting how we, as Jim mentioned, how we gather, how we report, how we say what is happening within philanthropy, that there's some digital software and elements that supports that. I think the third thing around dynamic localism, embedding a sense of resilience throughout philanthropy and for local communities to be able to step up and step in to determine their own development needs, their own resources. I think one thing that COVID has shown is that the resources actually are on the ground. In 1 year, billions were raised, whether in cooperatives, together from government, private sector, and citizens, but the money actually already resides here within the continent, and we don't necessarily need to look external or outside for that, but really on the ground, the infrastructure that is needed is really supporting resilience throughout civil society organizations and the sector. I think the last thing around dynamic localism is around strategic flexibility, has more capability for local organizations. And finally, connected to point 1 in terms of shifting the locus of power is really to end what I think we're referring to as a transactional partnership, really busting open the power dynamics that exist between external aid coming into the country through donors, INGOs, and if INGOs are really to be supportive of local resource mobilization on the ground, they do need to kind of take a step back, a back seat, devolve power, lead from the back in terms of supporting local organizations to really harness their fundraising activities to bring in more funding to the continent. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much for the point. The ideas that you've passed across really speak to me and really speak to the general conversation that seems to be going on right now within African development practitioners and this space. The idea that money already resides here on the continent, to have us, not be totally dependent as civil society on foreign aid, and also questions the practice of philanthropy here on the continent. Now, I'm aware that Tendai has done extensive work on philanthropic systems in Africa, on certain kinds of indigenous models of philanthropy that can be addressed. And I'm hoping this will be a good platform for him to also speak to the question of if there is a need to reassess the current philanthropic practice more against the against the westernized systems that currently operate on the continent. Tendai?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ese, and for the colleagues that have joined on this discussion. I think, and I'm building upon, sorry, I said Ese, should have said Eme. Both of you are my sisters. I worked with Ese at Trust Africa, and now I'm working with you, Eme. So the issue is, when it comes to discussing philanthropy here in Africa, there's a big story to be told. It's a significant story, because if you look, and if you've been tracking Africa from the 1950s up until now, in 2003, there was the issue around Africa, the hopeless continent. Then in 2013, thereabouts, now there was the spotlight on change, etc., Africa, the rising continent. And linked to that is a growth of a certain tendency in terms of wealth accumulation and its redistribution. We see a growth in the number of African billionaires that are based on the continent, that are accumulating on the continent. It's not only billionaires, but also the growth of millionaires. According to a study that we did when I was still at Trust Africa, we had tracked and we had come across around 163,000 millionaires spread across Africa. Then when you look at that and you come back into the field of philanthropy, you look at the number of foundations that have been established since the turn of the century, or just the decade before the turn of the century. There's been a significant growth in our foundations that have been established by Africa's high net worth individuals. So you're talking of the T.Y. Danjumas, Dangote, Strive, and Tsitsi establishing High Life Foundation here in Zimbabwe, the Motsepes establishing the Motsepe Foundation, and also some of them being bold enough to go and even sign the Giving Pledge together with Warren Buffett and Bill Gates around that, making sure that they'll give away their fortunes, etc. So I think that's, if you park that and understand that there's something that is very important that is happening on the continent. There's a bit of mimicry, we agree. There's a lot of mimicking of what is sort of coming out of the West, the way foundations are established, etc. But there's a lot that is unique about the African philanthropist. Number one, we are in the generation whereby most of the African founders of these foundations are still alive, and they are very active in their foundations. So if you look at pioneers like Tony Elumelu, Strive Masiyiwa, Dangote, they're at the forefront of the work of their foundations, and they influence the strategic direction of that. And beyond them giving away money, which is what we expect of philanthropy half the time, but COVID-19 has shown us that they are just not about giving money. So we see, for instance, I've just finished a case study of Strive Masiyiwa and the work he's been doing around COVID-19. So you see their multifaceted roles. On the one hand, they are donors of huge resources. Just in total, what we have seen since 2003, and colleagues at Bridgespan have done this study, around 13 billion has been given by high net worth individuals based on the continent to different causes. And they've also sort of worked closely with the AU in terms of responding to the Ebola outbreak in Liberia, Sierra Leone at that time. And we also see them coming on board to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. But as they respond to the COVID pandemic, we begin to learn certain things about them, that they are just not about money. Number one, they also play a huge advocacy role. Strive Masiyiwa played a role in working alongside the AU and the Economic Commission for Africa to make sure that Africa was prioritized in the vaccination drive, that Africa could be could also access affordable ventilators, et cetera, et cetera. So they are advocates on one hand. They are influencers. Using the fortunes that they have, they leverage other resources into the continent. We see this with Dangote working with Bill Gates around the polio vaccination drive in Africa. So then also they are knowledge producers. If you look at Mo Ibrahim and the Ibrahim Governance Index, so they are producing important knowledge that is African-centric, etc., contributing to that. So that's one movement that we see. There's another movement that is on the ground, which I hope that at a certain point, these two movements that look parallel to each other will meet, is the movement that is sort of influenced by what some of us in Southern Africa call Ubuntu. I am because you are. So we find, and they do not call themselves this, but we find a lot of community initiatives that are born out of our rural forms of social organization, the different collectives that are established there. And again, these are beyond money. But when we always say this, a hospital can only treat an individual, but it takes a community to heal. And we see a lot of community-led drives, initiatives, especially during COVID-19, responding to this in certain instances, actually rendering governments ineffective or irrelevant. So what we are seeing is these are formations that have a strong sort of background in the agrarian mode of accumulation, but we're beginning to see them coming into the urban settings, and we're seeing that there's some form of reinvention that is happening. So when people talk about a GoFundMe campaign, etc., for some of us, we've been sort of looking at African modes of organization. We say, but this we've been doing for years. For every cause, we would either mobilize labor, would mobilize assets to help till a field for a community that does not have assets, etc. And in the events of the shortage of, say, grain, etc., there's always been a communal granary that we all go to, etc. So I think that is sort of the organic forms of the solidarity, which we call philanthropy now. That is sort of, we're beginning to see it move into urban settings. We're beginning to see even diaspora communities organizing around their points of origin and beginning to plow back in terms of social support to extended families back, and also developing maybe community hospitals and clinics where they came from, but with that sort of mindset and that DNA in them. So I think when we begin to say, can we reassess current philanthropic practices, we have to think about these, how they are going to merge, because there's something that we have to think about as we're talking about this, to say, we just don't want to import a certain form of practice. So when you look at HNWs, the high net worth individuals, I think one thing that is worrying is the fact that they do not necessarily fund NGOs the way foundations from the West would fund NGOs. Even here in Africa, there are very few NGOs that can say they are sort of a major component of their budget is funded by African philanthropy. That has not happened, because most of these foundations being established by African high net worth individuals are actually also involved in direct implementation. So that's something that we need to say, is this a good practice or is it a challenge? Then secondly, the philanthropy that we are seeing, especially led by high net worth individuals, is yet to go to the structural issues that beset Africa. So we're yet to see this philanthropy investing, say, in dealing with corruption, governance, social justice, because others argue that the kind of philanthropy that we have that is led by high net worth individuals is compromised by the sort of close relationship that they have with their governments. Because if you look at how they accumulated, it is through maybe state facilitated arrangements, and for them to come and be forcefully push an accountability agenda, a governance reform agenda, they see it as compromising sort of even their business interests. So I think that's one of the challenges we have when these foundations are still intricately linked to the parent company where they are coming from. So all these things, we are not yet in a place of saying we've settled. We're in a state of flux. And like Essa is saying, when there are these platforms like the one she mentioned, the Africa Philanthropy Forum, a place where we can begin to influence the practices of high net worth giving, and also how it can begin to support an ecosystem instead of just them maybe seeing themselves as responsible for direct implementation, etc. So in a nutshell, I would say that, yes, it is time to reassess, but it is also a difficult time to judge, because it's still a field that is emerging. We're still trying to understand how it's going to pan out, and also how they learn from each other, and also how they're influenced by external practices. If I may stop here, then we can continue.
Thank you so much, Tendai. That was so engaging, and I can even see from the chat that a lot of people are also, questions are really coming up from your insights. And I can see, I'm just going to take out this time to let everyone know that we see your questions and they are being collated. And then once the speakers are done, the Q&A session, which will start in a bit, will go on, and I'll give the speakers time to actually address any engaging questions that may come in. But based off what Tendai has said, and especially as it regards the place how African philanthropy is emerging, and this is not a space or a time to judge things or what systems or processes really that seem not to work in our favor, but to come together and then try to work out practices that would only benefit the system as a whole, practices that are more localized and indigenized, and that cannot move us and to where we want to go. And this really is the idea and the thing behind this discussion. And so I looked to Jim to also add his own insight on if Africa's civil society, if philanthropists and agencies, network and multilateral organizations like the APF, APN, regional bodies spread out all over the continent that are coming up, that are doing amazing work, if together we have what it takes to foster an effective ecosystem for development on the trajectory that we are going by the SDG goals for 2030.
Thank you very much. That's a very complex question. But just to say, philosophically or vision-wise, all these institutions really have a great vision for the continent. They have good wishes for the people of Africa, and they are actually doing some great work. However, there is the element of silos. The level of collaboration is not that strong to ensure that they effectively collaborate amongst themselves, and most importantly, stretch and ensure that that collaboration relays effectively with other stakeholders on the ground to ensure that, the efforts, both at their individual levels, at the collective levels, can relate to inform the kind of transformation that we really want to see, that we really want to see. For example, if you take ECOWAS, the ECOWAS vision of an ECOWAS of the peoples, it is, I don't know, surprising, I would put it, to say that if you travel by road from, say, Lagos to Abidjan, so Lagos in Nigeria to Abidjan, that's a stretch that can take you, say, about 20-24 hours by road, and you just ask the common man by the road at each of those border points, do you know about ECOWAS? Very few of them will know about ECOWAS, but this is an institution that is there supposedly representing the interest of the people as they claim, but the people who are supposed to feel the impact of the existence of such an institution are not significantly feeling that impact. And we can equally raise that if you bring that to ECAS in Central Africa, it's the same thing. And even the measures they put in place that can even facilitate development, that can facilitate positive living, that can even promote that sense of common giving towards a common cause, is not that effective in a way that strengthens the effectiveness of the existence of these institutions to respond to the needs of the African people, or the African people that they stand to serve. So it's really very important for many of these institutions to rethink their modus operandi and ensure that these approaches are not should I say solely bureaucratic, high level, and miss out on connecting with local actors, miss out on connecting with Africans on the ground to ensure that there is that bottom-up contribution as well as top-down influence of these institutions on the people. Because it is only when we do that that we can collectively, with the guidance of these institutions, work to ensure that there is a harmonious approach and a collective engagement to respond to the SDGs that all of us hope will be achieved by the timeline that has been set. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That was so such a vibrant response. And then it keyed into what I see is a question that Charles has put in here. Hopefully I'm still clear. But it keyed into a question that, and Charles Kojo Van Dijk, also from WACSI, he asked, so how can civil society organizations promote a culture of giving? Is there evidence to show that charitable giving boosts active citizenship? And I'm throwing this question open to you, Jim, based off your reflections on present system and situation with organizations on the continent.
Thank you very much. So how can civil society organizations promote a culture of giving? First of all, from the initial discussions and analysis, it is agreed that giving, that culture of giving is, part and parcel of the African people, is part and parcel of us. However, this question is very timely because, it is important for African civil society organizations whom we can, many of them are part of the local actors working on the terrain to ensure that they put in place practices that can influence community dwellers, to be more aware, more involved, and more interested and more involved in the practice or the continuous practice of giving, particularly to these institutions. However, there is, with regards to these civil society organizations, there is some degree of disconnect. First of all, there is the overly embedded mindset that when we have civil society organizations, they should be supported by contributions majorly from the West. So the first thing is that insufficient acceptance of the potentials that exist in our immediate environment. That makes it, such that our organizations now fail to tap from the immediate resources that can play a significant role to enable these organizations or enable our communities to develop at a faster rate than we are seeing now. So it's very important that organizations should change their mindset and agree or accept that local philanthropy is something that exists. We just need to devise ways to ensure that we tap into this pool of resources that we need. And in terms of pool of resources, we should look at both in kind and in cash. And we make sure that we devise mechanisms or systems that are contextually appropriate to benefit or pool these resources to us. In terms of attracting in cash contributions, for example, one key thing as a donor, you and I are donors in one way or the other. We like transparency. We call for transparency, we call for accountability from our government, and at the same time, that appeal equally goes to these organizations in our immediate environment. I can assure you that if you go into, let's say, many of the archives of these organizations, it will be challenging to see them presenting annual financial reports. And when you are able to present annual financial reports of what you've been able to raise, be it from your individual resources, from donations from institutions or grants from institutions, or even from communities, it builds that sense of trust, which is something that our organizations need to work on to ensure that they build a stronger rapport with communities, build a sense of trust, and that will motivate, community dwellers to be willing to sell a parcel of land to contribute a portion to an organization, that is doing some great work in the community. So, and for organizations that have understood the essence of transparency and accountability at their levels, be they micro or macro levels, they have been able to attract more resources from other stakeholders to ensure that collectively we contribute towards the development of our communities. And if we are able to put in place, practices that build trust, it can contribute to increase the contributions or involvement of stakeholders, community stakeholders, immediate stakeholders to our work, and that can go a long way to boost active citizenship, the kind of active citizenship that will make it possible for everyone or most of us Africans to be involved in the development trajectory of our communities, of our countries. Thank you.
That's very well said, Jim. Thank you so much for your insights, and then looking especially to the ideals of transparency, the place of corruption, accountability for both micro and macro organizations, and also how this calls in local communities, creating an ideal of trust, both at the local level, before even moving on to looking out for foreign trust from foreign partners and stakeholders. I'm just going to, so we have come to a section where we are open to taking questions. I've looked through the chat, and there are a couple of questions I would like to also share with our speakers. And then I'm going to be directing this to you, SA. So for SA, we have a question from Jane Butler, who is from United Way, and she's asking, how do we get African philanthropists to partner more effectively to support existing organizations and consortiums so we can scale capacity and programs versus the practice of each foundation going it alone, donating to one-off programs or developing their own programs.
Thanks, Emma. So I'll be a typical Nigerian here and answer the question with another question, and say, I think when we're talking about African philanthropy, sometimes some of the conversation is around trying to make African philanthropy fit a particular shape or design to the West. And really, what else is possible if we are to free our minds, ourselves from the current structures that we currently understand as what development is or what philanthropy is. And if you are able to unshackle yourself from that concept, what is left behind? What does that look like? It's a little bit, sort of echoing some of the comments that Tendai mentioned earlier when he presented. What you left behind sometimes is legitimacy. Do you have the right to be there as a funder or as a community foundation, a donor, to be in that community, to say that you are there to support, you are there to nurture, you are there to raise local voices, to have agency, to have capacity to be able to determine how they develop for themselves. Legitimacy matters when it comes to philanthropy. And the way that philanthropy has worked is that it mimics what the West has done. There are good elements there, there are bad elements there, but mostly it is a dynamic or a relationship that has really negative power dynamics connected to that. So without legitimacy, you can't give. And legitimacy is not because I have money or I have resources or I have knowledge. It's simply because we are neighbors and we care for one another. Similar to the Ubuntu sort of principles is that I am because you are. When Africans give, when we give, we are giving the portion that is yours that I just happen to have in my possession. And it isn't an entitlement thing. It is simply because this is how we are. Legitimacy, trust, ownership, accountability are things that we would have to now try to redesign or reimagine what that is. So how can local foundations, local community foundations ramp up more philanthropic giving? You need to actually sort of, do the same things we're asking INGOs to do. Give up power, listen more, be at a table without a prescribed solution or answer or expertise. Really be there to listen and to support and to value all the assets that are there on the table.
Thank you so much for your insights, Esther. I can see that more and more discussions are coming up. Thank you, Portia, for putting that link out there. This really speaks to, I understand what you mean, and it resonates with me when you say how African philanthropy and philanthropists themselves must really ask certain key questions to determine legitimacy of working within the continent. Tendai, we have a question here that I would like to just channel towards you. And the question says, how can we make indigenous African philanthropy more effective? Household to household helps, or do we need further support? And this question is from Ruth. She put it up earlier in the chat.
Okay, thank you so much. What we call indigenous philanthropy is, I think it's the sort of the communitarian forms of sort of how we socially organized in our communities from the beginning, especially with that transition from an agrarian mode into urbanized settings and also the diaspora settings. I think in terms of addressing immediate community needs, how strengthening those, etc., we see those sort of capacities being reinvented, being strengthened at a community level, even in urban settings. But I think the question that we ask is this adequate to deal with some of Africa's intractable challenges? That's the real challenge, to say, we have seen, if we're to study what has happened in Western Europe, what has happened in the US, the role and the contribution of philanthropy to the big questions. Can our indigenous forms of philanthropy in their current settings, can they contribute to addressing the big questions? Yeah, that's the question that we need, and it's a research question that we need to ask. But in terms of livelihood strengthening at that level and also providing maybe welfare support systems, yes, but I think we really need to look at how we can sort of leverage even technology, etc., to begin to say, how do we mobilize what looks like atomized giving? You know, we're giving in silos in different communities, those small amounts, but in an aggregate manner, they actually contribute quite a lot. But the challenge is always to do with the structure. How do we create a structure that is national in orientation, that moves away from one local village, but begins to address at a national level? So once we can crack that, and there are certain groups that have cracked that. If you go to Kenya, groups like KCDF, have sort of started around sort of mobilizing around on a national platform and beginning to make sure that there is actually a movement of sorts. Because at the center of this conversation, and the question that we are not asking, or the elephant in the room, is actually a challenge of the development framework or paradigm that we're talking about. Because I think COVID-19 gives us this opportunity of thinking around communities or thinking around Africa in a deglobalized sense, because, you know, we've spent the past 15 or 16 months with very limited travel and interaction with the international world. So the question is, what has created resilience during this time? And how do we build upon that to make sure that we actually can forge a new development path that is based on domestic resource mobilization and this asset-based mindset? And it's in everything. It's in our civil society organizations, in our communities, because I think for so long, the paradigm we are under is a paradigm that Africa and even the organizations that we work with are looking outside for assistance, not looking inside within our communities for resources, etc. So I think COVID-19, if you look at the opportunity of COVID-19, is the prospects of breaking that mode of underdevelopment. It's not a development mode, it's underdevelopment, because it keeps us subjugated to a certain form of support that is to come coming from another geographic area. But because now we're in a place whereby we actually have to reimagine to say, you're on your own, Africans, what can you do on your own? So we go back to all those sort of what you're calling the indigenous philanthropic models or forms, and begin to say, how do we work around this to replicate them and to make sure that they're at the center of the sort of the development model that we are aspiring for as a continent, because everything else has been tried. The FDI model has been tried. SA has already demonstrated the extent to which the flaws actually are not to our advantage, but they actually negatively affect Africa's resource base. So when we're thinking about that, this is an opportunity for us to say, can we borrow from our indigenous philanthropic models and begin to say, play around with them and see how they can contribute towards sort of Africa's inclusive development? I think the word being inclusive, because we really need to find ways of saying, how do we make sure that we do not leave anyone behind? I see we're making a reference to SDGs. That's the most important part. And we believe, some of us in the philanthropy space, that if we embrace and model alongside community or communitarian sort of foundations, we can actually ensure a more inclusive takeoff rather than the kind of sort of unequal growth we see by the capitalist model that we have imported and we're trying to run with.
Thank you so much for that, Tendai. So I'm looking through the comments, and I'm just going to read out a few engaging comments from here. So we have Mukasa Abdul, who says, culturally in our traditional setting, we are givers according to the way we live. But our challenge is to change how we think of the West as givers and we as at the receiving end. Therefore, let us work on our mindset and heart set to change our perception of how we view the Western countries. That is, we contribute to religious fundraising drives like building churches and mosques and all that. And I also see Ms. Janet Mario, who also adhered to what Jim had said about the importance of transparency for local communities, ending with if local people gain appreciation of local nonprofits and that they are playing a critical role in an honest manner and are trusted, then they will give towards their work. So she does agree with Jim. And thank you so much also, Tendai, for the insights there, especially as speaks to creating more communitarian models of civil society institutions here on the continent, and trying to rethink and reassess the processes that work for Africa here and for development, the process of development on the continent. So we are at a time where I'll be going around for each speaker to kind of give us what they think or their reflections based on their experience and expertise, and also to a global audience on how best we can foster a better understanding and practice of African philanthropy. I'll start with Jim.
Thank you very much. I think to foster a better understanding of African philanthropy, we should build on what we have. And again, building on what we have is strengthening the practices that we've been engaged in, and making sure that more and more individuals know that this practice is ongoing, know what this practice is resulting into, and what it is contributing to in terms of our development. And permit me to just use this opportunity. I think I shared in my previous submission about the essence of transparency, accountability, and reporting. And I read a very useful comment on, should we follow the complex models of reporting? Maybe I should just clarify that if I use the word reporting, it's not necessarily to follow those standards of reporting that have been or were shared by INGOs. What can any receiver or recipient on the continent who is receiving contributions from local actors, from citizens in their countries, what means or mechanisms can they use to share and provide feedback, provide an update on what has been received and what that will be used for? If I take the case of the Ministry of Public Health in Cameroon, during the COVID era, where the peak of COVID in the country, the government solicited that individuals, Cameroonians, corporates, should contribute to help to alleviate the pandemic. And there were people contributing $2, there were those contributing $20, there were those contributing $200,000. All of this was collated in a Word document and shared in public for people to know. That is reporting. And I think many of those local actors who can be at the center of fostering or promoting a greater sense of African philanthropy are not adequately providing information on what they are receiving from their immediate environment and how that can, or what that is translating to. Because if that information is shared, it will really catalyze that spirit of giving for a common cause, giving for common good, and really, it will really help us if we have that information to be more aware that this practice is continuing, which we know, we can do it, we should be part of it, we can be part of it in whatever way. And also the element of documenting our practices, it's really key. It will really be essential for me to know what is happening in Abuja, know what is happening in Tanzania, to strengthen what is happening in Cameroon, or what is happening in Cameroon we share so that others in other parts of the continent can know and possibly harness their practices. But that practice culture of sharing information on what is happening around African philanthropy is not really substantial vis-a-vis what we are experiencing in terms of the practice itself. And it sometimes creates that gap or that vacuum that gives the perception that African philanthropy is not enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was so wholesome. I'll go on to Essay now, if you could also give us your thoughts.
Thanks. I think, as Africans, we've gotten into this habit of thinking that what we have is of no value, or at least is not as valuable as the thing from outside or the thing from the West. And we've talked about reimagining, rethinking, a different kind of mindset that really centers our work, centers our values, centers our history of how we've been. And I think that shifting, that realigning, I suppose, needs to happen because there's resilience there, and there's a lot of value COVID-19 has shown that we can raise the resources ourselves. We did. Communities that were left behind, that were used to being left behind pre-COVID from international donors, were now in the front lines doing the work, being left in front by international organizations that. So we've proven over and over again, but especially in last year, that we can look after ourselves to become it. We have the resources. There is a lot of money in Africa, just on an annual basis, the billions, thanks to that. So how do we and begin to demand our own terms, especially to international donors, not and instead of carrying or bending to their particular demands and wishes.
All right, then, Essie, thank you. I would say there was a bit of a network break, but I'm hoping that we're all able to catch the bulk of what Essie said. I'm going to be moving on to Tendai. Please just give us a round of thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, and I appreciate this platform. So I think there's a recognition that there's something that has changed in Africa. That's why we're having this discussion. That there's something that is exciting, there's something that has potential to sort of bring some form of progress in Africa, because everyone keeps on saying, what shall be done for Africa? And now there's an exciting time that we're seeing Africans rising for themselves. So I think that alone should be supported, and we find ways of sort of enhancing that movement. That's number one. Then number two, I think in terms of the space itself, there's so many things that are outstanding. If you look at philanthropy in the West, especially in the US, we're using the 501c3 charity as an instrument and the tax sort of issues that come up with it, etc. Many African philanthropists, I'm talking here of high net worth individuals, do not get those incentives in their countries. So there's no tax incentive for giving. So imagine if the tax incentive were to be put in place, maybe that could actually grow sort of the kind of gifts, the size of giving that we have on the continent. Because at the moment they are giving despite the fact that there are no incentives. So I think that's one of many other regulatory issues that need to be looked at as we're talking about the growth of African philanthropy. Then number three, one of the challenges that we have is the lack of collaboration amongst philanthropy institutions, especially those established by high net worth individuals. In a study that we just concluded, 23% said they engage in some form of collaboration, information sharing, jointly funding. And when they're talking about this, then you ask, who are you collaborating with? They're collaborating with colleagues outside of Africa. So Africa to Africa collaboration is lacking. We're yet to see high net worth foundations established by high net worth individuals collaborating around an issue. So you will find a foundation in Nigeria collaborating with a foundation in the US, but you don't see foundations in Nigeria collaborating around an issue. But like Essa said, COVID-19 also taught us some things. We saw some collaboration. In South Africa, we saw the emergence of the Solidarity Fund, where many high net worth individuals put in resources there for a fund that was sort of supported by government. We saw the same in Uganda, we saw the same in Zimbabwe. So maybe this is also a turning point. And I think finally, my takeaway, there is a group of people that we're not talking about. Africa has got the second largest, fastest growing middle class, second to China. So half the time when we talk about African philanthropy, we talk of the billionaires, we forget the millionaires and what they are doing. And these do not normally establish their own foundations. They give to certain causes, and some prefer to give anonymously, and they are driven by their religious values, etc., etc. But the challenge is for us as researchers to begin to map that kind of giving and to find ways of saying, how do we contribute towards its institutionalization? And finally now is to say, I think this is a word of caution. The giving that we're talking about does not necessarily flow into NGOs, or does not necessarily have to flow into NGOs. So this is giving either to infrastructure projects, giving towards scholarships, etc. So the challenge that we have, and the Bridgespan study that I made reference to earlier, actually made reference to the fact that more and more African philanthropists do not give to NGOs. So I actually, initially, for me, it was a criticism, but actually thought about saying, maybe there's something that needs to be rethought, or that we need to think about and to look at when you're talking about NGOs in Africa. Why is it that they are missing out on high net worth giving? Maybe there's certain structures, certain processes of how we insert ourselves within communities, how we become sort of products of the communities, not as external agents of development. Because I think it's the comfort zone or the relationships, tenuous relationships we established with Western philanthropy that made us disentangle ourselves from communities. But if we're really talking about shifting the development discourse, NGOs need to find themselves more and more informed and led by community agendas so that they can also tap into some of these. Well, when you talk to high net worth individuals, they are not convinced about an NGO-led model. Yeah, so I think it's begin to ask these hard questions, and they're tough, but it's to begin to say, how do we make sure that we create a conversation between high net worth individuals who are coming into the development space and disrupting it using their own methods. Some of them are coming from the tech space. They have no time to work with intermediaries. They're directly implementing. These are challenges that we have to be thinking about. So like I said earlier, the work of philanthropy in Africa is work in progress. It's evolving. We are yet to see where it will end, and also how relationships will be forged. But at the moment, it's in a state of flux. We can only study it as it moves. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tendai. It's really been an amazing discussion with you, with Jim, and then with Essay. And I'm so grateful for everyone also in the comment section who has been putting in their 2 cents, trying to getting the discussion really going onto the direction that African philanthropy is taking. The questions that you have all put out have also assisted in guiding the discussion too, and giving us the takeaways that we have today. And for that, we are so grateful. I'm just going to use the opportunity to thank the Catalyst 2030 network, and then encourage everyone on the chat to also check in to the Catalyzing Change Week. There are other sessions coming up. Philanthropy Circuit belongs to the Africa chapter, and then I'm aware that there are other members of the Africa chapter who have curated sessions coming up later on today and tomorrow, and of course on the last day, which is Friday. This conversation, of course, is only ending here, but it's going to be continuing on a more general scale within more spaces. So my takeaway would be to encourage everyone who is here to explore avenues where they can cause and create change, to explore avenues where they can create knowledge and share knowledge, taking insights from there's a particular thread from what Jim has said and Essie has said and Tendai has said, and this all links to us being able to not just collaborate, but also to invest in ourselves as Africans, invest locally, invest in ideas and institutions, invest in transparency, because transparency and trust is currency in the NGO world. So invest for ourselves to see the kind of system and structure that we would want, and for it to grow in the direction that we hope it to grow. Thank you to everyone who has made our time to join in. I see you all and I appreciate you all. Philanthropy Circuit is always available to share and to foster collaborations. We are right off the mark, but the time is just 3 minutes past 2 o'clock. And I just want to use this opportunity to also thank Madalena, who has been the support system for this entire discussion, Susanna, and then everyone else who I'm unable to name, but really do appreciate. Thank you all, and do have a wonderful rest of the week. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.